Good evening. This is Making the Case. I'm your host, Yodit Tewolde. We start tonight with the stories of Kevin Strickland and Lamar Johnson, two men wrongfully convicted and imprisoned in Missouri for a combined 7 decades. Prosecutors in the counties where the men were prosecuted have tried to vacate their convictions, but in both cases, the courts have ruled that even though there is no doubt the men are actually innocent, they can't be released from prison. Kevin Strickland is 61 and has been in prison for 43 years since he was 18, convicted of a triple homicide by Jacksonville prosecutors. Lamar Johnson, he's been in prison for 26 years since he was 21, convicted of a murder in St. Louis. Missouri lawmakers passed a bill a few weeks ago that would finally give prosecutors in both counties the legal mechanism to vacate both men's convictions. There's just one problem. Missouri Governor Mike Parson hasn't signed the bill into law. But there's another way. The governor could grant pardons to both Mr. Strickland and Mr. Johnson with the stroke of a pen. In a statement just a couple of days ago, he said that in the case of Mr. Strickland, this just wasn't a priority. He didn't even bother addressing the case of Mr. Johnson, which hasn't gotten the same publicity that Mr. Strickland's case has. Infuriating, right? But it gets worse. Remember the McCloskeys, the gun-toting white couple who pointed assault rifles at peaceful protesters last year in St. Louis? The same couple who's being prosecuted by Kim Gardner, a black woman and county attorney, on firearms charges, minor charges that they could get probation for. But as soon as those charges were announced, the Missouri Attorney General made it quite clear that he would immediately pardon the white couple if they were convicted. Yes, the double standard is obvious. Oh, and Martin McCloskey, he's running as a Republican for Missouri Senate. No conflict of interest there, right? We've reached out to the governor's office and, of course, we've heard nothing back. Back with me again to discuss both cases is Tricia Rojo Bushnell, who is an attorney and executive director of the Midwest Innocence Project. They represent both Kevin Strickland and Lamar Johnson. Tricia, thank you so much for coming on tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so let's start with Lamar Johnson in his case. We've had you on before to talk about his case, but for viewers who might have missed that segment, can you talk us through how he ended up in prison and how attempts were made by the DA's office to overturn his conviction?
Yeah, Lamar Johnson was convicted 25 years ago based essentially on manufactured evidence. Police and prosecutors worked together to manufacture a motive and an identification of Lamar. Essentially, this was a shooting that happened at night in the dark. Two perpetrators wearing ski masks came running down a hill and shot at a porch. One man died, the other survived. The surviving victim said he couldn't identify anyone, but essentially police worked with him and essentially provided him payments to make an identification of Lamar. Lamar had an alibi. A police officer testified that even though that he could have actually made it in that time from where he was to the crime scene, even though that wasn't possible. And combining all of those things, including the use of a jailhouse informant whose full background wasn't used, the state was able to secure this conviction. Fast forward to 2019, Kim Gardner is elected to the St. Louis Circuit Attorney, the prosecutor. She founds a conviction integrity unit and starts reviewing Lamar's case. And she finds actually evidence of this payments. Even though we've been asking for evidence of these payments for nearly a decade, nothing was ever disclosed. She comes in, she finds it in the files. The real perpetrators have confessed. They've come forward. It's a solved crime. And she says this person is innocent. Conviction integrity unit writes an extensive report about it. And she filed a motion for new trial asking for Lamar's conviction to be overturned in 2019. That case went all the way up to the Missouri Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled earlier this year that prosecutors don't have the ability to overturn a conviction through a motion for new trial. And so that's sort of where Lamar has been ever since.
And those payments to that witness, that was never disclosed to the defense attorneys or the jury, correct?
That's correct. They didn't know at that time, and they didn't know in the decade that we ourselves sent open records requests asking for proof of those payments, and were told no such payments existed. When they found the proof of the payments, not only did the payments, there was the proof there, our requests were also in that same folder.
And nothing happened to the prosecutors in not disclosing that information?
No, nothing's happened to the prosecutors or to the detectives who investigated the case.
All right, now to Kevin Strickland's case. Walk us through the investigation done by Jackson County prosecutors and what they found was so problematic about his conviction.
Yes, So Mr. Strickland was convicted actually in 1979, and this was a triple homicide that had happened in Kansas City on the opposite side of the state, where one of the victims survived. When police came to the house, she immediately named two of the real perpetrators and said she couldn't identify the other two. There were 4 people total. One of those individuals was a man named Vincent Bell. After Mr. Strickland was convicted, Vincent Bell, just 3 months later, in his own plea in front of the court under oath, testified as to what happened, named all of the other perpetrators, and also said that Mr. Strickland was innocent. 2 of the other real perpetrators have come forward and also said that Mr. Strickland was innocent, but he was convicted because that sole victim who had survived ultimately later gave Mr. Strickland's name and identified him after a friend said, well, couldn't his description, the description she had given of one of the people she didn't know, couldn't that have matched Kevin Strickland? And what was important is she actually knew Kevin Strickland before the crime occurred and didn't name him at the time. So the prosecutor, in this case, we took this to the prosecutor. They began investigating that. The victim herself had come forward in 2009 and tried to recant. She had told multiple individuals that she had felt forced to make this identification. So when the Jackson County prosecutors reviewed not only her recantation, but also the evidence from the real perpetrators who had confessed and the absolute corroborated plea agreement from Vincent Bell, and also new additional testing of fingerprints on the murder weapon that excluded Mr. Strickland and found that he was absolutely innocent. So they wrote this letter and a report saying he was innocent, and we filed to the Missouri Supreme Court asking him to release Mr. Strickland because he's actually innocent with the support of the prosecutors, and unfortunately that was denied earlier this month.
So what was the evidence that they used to convict him in the first place? Because I'm not hearing anything.
It was the identification made by this victim that didn't come until later and that she now says is coerced. But that was essentially all they had. In the terms of the investigators at the time, they say the case rose and fell on her identification.
Wow. Okay, so why has Mr. Strickland's case been in the news this past week?
So he's been noticed, one, because the Missouri Supreme Court declined to hear his case, denied it without any reasoning or explanation. And 2, on May 31st, Governor Parson had pardoned 36 individuals, and Mr. Strickland's name was not on that list. And I think for many Missourians, there's a real concern or question when we know someone is innocent, how can they remain there, right? How is he still there when even the prosecutor thinks that he should come home?
It makes you wonder what the other cases were about if you did a comparison, because I mean, from what I'm hearing about Kevin Strickland's case, there's nothing that now points him to this crime. You have prosecutors who are saying he didn't do it. So I don't understand why he wasn't a part of that 36 that were pardoned. But let's move on to this bill that passed through the Missouri legislature, which is yet to be signed into law. Has the governor given a reason why he hasn't signed it, and is he expected to do so soon?
I don't think there's been any indication. So this bill included a number of other provisions of about criminal justice reform. I don't think that there's been any indication that he won't sign it, but certainly I think folks are waiting for all of these things to be passed. This bill, if signed, would go into effect on August 28th. So that even means that even if signed, the prosecutor couldn't file a motion for new trial for Mr. Strickland or for Lamar Johnson until August 28th.
So the governor, but he has another option. The governor could just pardon Mr. Strickland and Mr. Johnson. So what is the Missouri Attorney General's record on granting clemency applications to people who were wrongfully convicted and later exonerated?
Well, so in terms of the governor, it is actually very unusual for a governor to pardon folks with significant convictions. One of our former clients, Rodney Lincoln, was someone who benefited from the clemency powers when Eric Greitens commuted his sentence on his last day in office. In terms of the Attorney General is the responding party to these state habeas petitions, one of which has been filed on behalf of Mr. Strickland and one of which is forthcoming for Lamar Johnson in these sort of circuit courts. And these processes take a really long time. They take years to get through and to appeal. And in regards to the Attorney General, I mean, traditionally what we've seen is that the Attorney General has fought all of these cases. There's actually a report in Injustice Watch that shows the Attorney General's office has fought every innocence case for the last 3 decades, the last 30 years. So, there's the issue here is we just have sort of two people caught in the crossfires of the fact that we have a system that doesn't allow them just to be out, even though everyone recognizes they're innocent.
A system that's supposed to uncover the truth, right? And it has, and it's now being ignored. So what can those who want to help either Kevin or Lamar, what can they do?
Well, folks can absolutely go to our website and keep following information and learning more about it. There are a number of different organizations who have come out in support of both Lamar Johnson and Kevin Strickland. You know, lending your voice to them, lending your voice to us is always helpful. And there's also been a GoFundMe started for Mr. Strickland, who, you know, he's spent 42 years incarcerated, and he and Lamar Johnson both, when they return to the free world, will come out with nothing, because Missouri also does not compensate individuals who are exonerated.
All right, attorney and executive director of the Midwest Innocence Project, Tricia Rojo Bushnell, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much.